This is West 8th Street, New York University.
From New York University, you're listening to Conversations, hosted by President Andy Hamilton. In each episode, Andy talks insight, inquiry, and imagination with a leading mind from the NYU community.
We have with us Tim Naftali, and Tim is a noted expert on US presidential history, national security, intelligence policy. He's been the author of several books. Many of you will recognize Tim's voice, or you will know his face if you saw it, as he is a very frequent contributor to CNN and many other outlets on television and in the media. Most importantly for us at NYU, Tim is a professor here. He has a joint appointment as Clinical Associate Professor of History in the Faculty of Arts and Science, and also as Clinical Associate Professor of Public Service at Wagner. And he is Director of NYU's undergraduate public policy major. Tim, it's wonderful to have you here to talk about politics, and especially presidential politics.
Well, President Hamilton, thank you. Thank you for asking me to talk about things that I love talking about and care deeply about.
Well, let's begin, and here we are. We are in the early stages of a presidential campaign. We are halfway through the first term of President Trump. As someone who's written extensively on JFK, on George H.W. Bush, on Richard Nixon, looking at each of them through the context of their own rather disparate presidencies, where do you place the Trump presidency, the 2 years that we've had of the Trump presidency, and what are the headline conclusions we can draw?
Every so often, a presidential candidate will promise a revolution, not an armed revolution, but a change in the spirit, the mores, and the policies of the incumbent or predecessor. So it is not unusual for American presidents to promise disruption. The current president's so-called hero, I'm not sure he knows that much about this particular president, but he often talks about Andrew Jackson. Before Jackson, there was Jefferson, who led a revolution of mores and policy. In the more recent period, Ronald Reagan is noted for a revolution. So in that sense, it's not unusual in American history to have a president who comes in and says, I want to change everything my predecessor did, or most everything. What is unusual about this disruptor is that it is not clear what he wishes to replace, what he inherited, what he wishes to replace it with.
Yeah.
There is a sense of nihilism, of destruction for the sake of destruction, without the objective of a new approach to governance. Ronald Reagan, who I think changed the way many Americans think about government, wanted smaller government, and I think, and this has not, I think, helped the American people, gave the impression that government is generally the source of the problem and not the solution. But he didn't want to completely do away with it. He staffed the government, and he looked for intelligent people to be in the government. And when people didn't work out, he removed them because they were incompetent. So even though he brought in a revolution, he did not want to undermine completely Washington and the sort of community of elites and professionals who direct federal policy. He wanted to change them, but he wasn't an opponent of the federal, if you will, the federal society. Donald Trump, from his inauguration, leaving aside the election, because many of us who study elections think there's always a possibility of a pivot. That you'll hear that word, pivot. It means that someone will run promising a set of actions and using some language that they don't replicate once they have the power of the office, because the office itself is an awesome thing. And there was a moment, it was very brief, when it seemed possible that, like many of his predecessors, Donald Trump would be affected by the august power and the responsibility of the office. And to remember that is just to look at a photograph of Donald Trump sitting with Barack Obama. This is during the transition. And President Trump looks as if he's a deer caught in the headlights. He seems dazed, confused. It's as if, as President Obama was explaining to him the real nature of the office that he unexpectedly won, that he begins to think, oh my goodness, this is going to be a lot tougher. But then he gives his inaugural address. And his inaugural address is unusual. First of all, it doesn't mention any previous president. So it's as if, like after like after the revolution in France, they're changing the calendar. It's as if everything is going to be different because the first emperor has been selected. And from that moment on, the president has acted as if everything that over 200 years of history, all of the accumulated wisdom and accumulated norms and accumulated traditions, that none of them mattered. And that all that mattered was his personal relationship with his base. And that's new.
But Tim, isn't that an inevitable consequence? You started with Reagan and small government. We've then had the anti-Washington positions of George W. Bush. We've then had the Tea Party gaining its anti-Washington ground. Is Trump just an inevitable consequence of that trajectory of undermining everything that Washington works on?
Well, there is a debate in history, and my professional training is in history, but the whole concept of inevitability. But I learned in graduate school the phrase overdetermined, which means that it's really likely it's going to happen. Yeah. I think that it was really likely that at a certain point, because of the disappearance of the Soviet Union as a threat, because of the weakening of the Islamist threat, that Americans would be motivated to choose someone for reasons other than they were presidential. Because the definition of presidential in the Cold War meant somebody you trusted with the nuclear button.
Yep.
So you combine that with the nature of social media and the information system that has arisen pell-mell, really, since the late 90s. And you had, if you will, a petri dish that could produce a Trump presidency. We never knew when it would happen, but it was possible. Whether it was inevitable, let's just say it was likely.
We've had a period now of 75 years of relative peace, some bumps along the way, but relative peace in the Western world. So you're suggesting that this is almost again, back to a consequence. That's almost a consequence of that period of calm.
Yes, and I think, and this, I think I hope one of your guests in future will be a sociologist or an anthropologist, but I think that we need to be thinking deeply about the relationship between governing elites. And by the way, when I say elite, I don't necessarily mean that they have a lot of money. What I mean are people who've decided for one reason or another to be in our great major here at NYU. No, to study public policy and to do public service.
Yeah.
And the people that they are responsible to and whose lives presumably they want to help. There's been a widening of the conversations between these two groups such that there's no longer a national conversation. We have these siloed conversations. Now, I'll give you a perfect example of it. Free trade. Free trade became popular among left and right in the government. There was almost a consensus in the governing world in the 90s. It starts in the 60s. I'm talking about the United States. But by the 90s, there is a sense among Democrats and Republicans, the ones that had power, that free trade was the way to go. What was promised to the public was a bit of a fantasy. I'm not saying that free trade isn't a good idea. I studied economics. I believe in free trade. But free trade has costs. And you can't tell people that everyone is going to benefit equally. And you also have to tell people that they may have to move. Free trade works because of the free movement of goods, services, and capital, human capital. you can't promise people they can live in northern New York forever and expect to benefit from the economy that's going to be created from free trade. We didn't do that.
Yep.
And so as time progressed and as the threat from another state or non-state actor declined, people began to say, well, these elites are promising us things. Yes, we're protected, but now maybe let's look at what they're promising us. And he found it wanting. And that was an opening to someone like Trump. Now, we'd seen this before. In the early 90s, we saw a movement that was anti-free trade. And it was sort of the reform.
We've just had the death of Ross Perot.
Ross Perot was the leader of that. His basic approach was he was anti-free trade, and he was making many of the arguments that Donald Trump makes today. He didn't get traction. He got 19% of the popular vote in 1992, in part because of the collapse sadly, of the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. I say sadly because it was a better administration than its PR at that point. But Perot was, if you think of it as that first run, Perot faced a unified Republican and Democratic elite. Both were arguing for free trade. The Clintonistas were pro-free trade. Now, the mood has changed, and Trump took advantage of a reluctance that the American people have long had to embrace free trade.
How do you see the link between the style, the rise, the impact of President Trump and other disruptors, populists leading, obviously, European? We've got the five-star movement in Italy. Boris Johnson in the United Kingdom has embraced that strong voice and populist position.
Well, I see this as a global wave. I am reluctant to call it populism because that implies that all of these leaders are representing a very large group of people. I think they are personifying anger and resentment, but I also think they're gaming the system for power. You can be a populist and want to change institutions to better serve the people. For example, the populists in American history in the late 19th century, they wanted currency, they wanted credit. These were mainly farmers that were having difficulty dealing with the banking world. So they actually wanted a proliferation of currency. They wanted the government to print more money, and they wanted money to be based on both silver and gold. The point was they didn't want to destroy the banking system. They wanted it to work for them. So you can be historically a populist and not be a disruptor of institutions. What we are seeing, sadly, is a wave of authoritarian thinking which requires the subjugation of institutions for the sake of unitary actors. Why are we so vulnerable to that? I would argue it has to do with three factors. One, the information culture and its vulnerabilities. I'll get to that in a moment. Two, the unequal distribution of the benefits of the post-Cold War globalization of our systems. And three, the rise of charismatic individuals who are untethered for various reasons to the set of principles that drove the globalization that we saw post-1989. Now, by the way, you notice I don't say left and right. Because the commitment to globalization was a shared commitment. Now, there were differences, but those differences were not great. So those three factors. Now, the number one factor, the information system, is peculiarly vulnerable to interference. Now, I'm not going to say that Russia is responsible for populism, or what I would call disruptism. But Russia, which one of my specialties at certainly one point was the study of intelligence and deception. The Soviets tried very hard to mess with American domestic history, domestic affairs. They weren't that successful. There's a tradition in Moscow of trying to do this. They are much better at it now because the information systems are easier to control than they were in the Cold War. So I think that you have, on the one hand, you have this growing resentment and anger because elite promises were not met by reality, and you have a vulnerability created by the web social world, social media world, and you have bad actors like Russia and others, political factions, who are willing to take advantage of that. That is a toxic brew.
I'd like to ask a couple of questions just following on about leadership and the way in which the changing world is affecting leadership. And I once heard a former ambassador, an American ambassador to Moscow, say that readily available plane travel utterly changed the role of the ambassador because every US president would want to fly themselves to Moscow or to London or to Paris to engage in a negotiation or a major issue. And thus the role of the ambassador to some extent was diminished, and the role of the leader themselves. In a sense, with social media, with the 24-hour media cycle, to what extent are we seeing, a fundamental change in the nature even of cabinet government? It's striking in this era of President Trump and his constant tweeting how much of American policy, or at least American positioning, seems to be coming from him at 3:00 in the morning rather than coming from the Secretary of State or the Secretary of State for the Environment or the Secretary of Energy, and they are coming directly from the boss through this power of instant communication to the electorate.
I wish to apologize for the segue, but I'll get back to answer your question. One of the points I make in class, to all of my classes, is this is a wonderful time to be a young person. Because you are, in a way that is not true for your professors when they were your age, you are a curator of not only of your own experience. We're always curators of our own experience, but you're a curator of information in a way that others weren't. You have access to more information. You have fewer obstacles, but it also has a burden, because that's, in the past you would go to other people to get reading lists. You still do to do well on your exams, but your access to information is something that is beyond the imagination of people of a certain generation. What that means is that presidents can talk to you directly, and they could before. Franklin Roosevelt, the fireside chats. That was an innovation because, though he wasn't the first president to use radio, Calvin Coolidge, who's known as Silent Cal, he did speak a few times. He used the radio, but it's Roosevelt who revolutionized this and actually became the first personal president. When Roosevelt died, many of the people who were interviewed said they felt they had lost a member of their family. That's remarkable for a political leader. So the idea of a personal connection between the leader and the people is not new. What is new is that the president can blot out other sources of information by delegitimating it. And we have a president now who has two objectives. The first objective is to create a reality. An example that will not be as recent when this is aired, but the president made a mistake about where Hurricane Dorian would go, and instead of admitting that there was no way it was going to go to the western side, but Alabama on the western side of Florida, somebody produced a hurricane map that indicated the possibility. That's an example of creating an alternate reality, and that is a consistent characteristic of this president. And that's really, he's taken it to a new level. Yeah. Presidents have spun before this new. Yeah. But there's another side to it, which is the delegitimation of people, of other sources of information but the presidency. Calling the press the enemy of the people, calling certain organizations in the press, you mentioned that I appear on CNN is one of the targets, New York Times, Washington Post, places where there could be legitimate news that would not be what he wants the public to read, delegitimating it in the beginning. So that when they do come up with bad information about the administration, he can say, I told you, don't believe them. So what we have here in this new information environment is a masterful and malicious magician. And it is a result, I think, of the fact that we are all our own curators. And it's just not happening here. And I think that this is opening the door to the kind of personal rule in places with weak institutions that we've seen in the earlier part of the 20th century. I'm not going to use certain words to say it's a certain kind of political authoritarianism. You don't need to use the word. What it is, though, is a breaking down of institutions and the leader saying, I understand you. I work for you, and those who oppose me don't. Trust me.
You know, one thing that's, to me, been rather remarkable in these last months and years has been a focus on a rise of the special advisor and the role of the special advisor in influencing the behavior of the head person, the boss. And so the question for you, Tim, is, give me some sense of the historical perspective. When I look at Steve Bannon in the early months of Trump, now Stephen Miller, in the UK, we've got Boris Johnson and the evil genius, as he's called, of Dominic Cummings. Is that something new as a result of this changed media and in immediate connection climate that you're describing, or has it always been that way?
There have always been kitchen cabinets and special advisors. We worry about them when they're disruptors. Sometimes they're institutionalists. Sometimes they believe in the better angels of a certain society, and at that point we sort of applaud them. These special advisors seem to have hatred for the give and take that one expects in a republic or constitutional democracy. Their objective is to paralyze it and make it impossible. It's like someone who plays a sport, and if they're going to lose the game, they're going to break the leg of the referee. We're going to do something to make sure the game doesn't end, rather than saying, I'm going to lose this match, this game, but I'm going to work harder and I'm going to win the next one. That's what makes these special advisors unusual. Look, presidents have been seeking special connections and special sources of information throughout the modern era. John F. Kennedy used his brother Bobby to meet secretly with the Soviets. He bypassed his own ambassadors. The ambassador didn't even know in the beginning about these meetings. Richard Nixon used Henry Kissinger, bypassed the experts, the China experts in his own government, in order to do what he felt was necessary. And he did it secretly until he was ready to tell the world in 1971. So it is not unusual for there to be special access for certain individuals. But we, as analysts and historians and citizens, should be prepared to assess the costs of that special relationship in terms of the consequences. So far, the consequences in the Trump era have been painful disruption of alliances with traditional allies, horrible scenes on the border, confinement of children, separation of children from their parents, uncertainty at home as to whether we have a government that will treat all Americans, regardless of race or religion, the same. These are the consequences of the power, I believe, of those close to the president. And there's something else to be kept in mind. I believe that during the Cold War, the United States was lucky, the world was lucky, that despite the fact that partisanship continued, a group of men, would have been nice if a woman too had been elected, were elected who were serious about the office and understood the serious consequences of being responsible for the button. That was not inevitable. And some of them were better informed than others. But Ronald Reagan, who was often criticized for being ill-informed, took his job seriously. And the mark, I think, of a very successful leader is he changed his mind. He changed his mind on the Soviet Union when he understood that Gorbachev wanted reform. It wasn't inevitable that the United States would be led by a serious leader. We now have someone who seems not to be serious, and he's surrounded by very serious advisors with axes to grind.
One casualty of this period, and it's a casualty that we see daily in the political process, is the loss of the skill, the ability to seek compromise, to seek consensus. The ability of leaders to change their mind, to reach out to opponents in other countries. Is that something that you think is being irretrievably damaged?
I think the answer for the United States, the answer is not irretrievably. I'm a hopeless optimist. I mean, I don't think you can be an effective teacher if you're cynical. And so I'll admit to everyone, I have some idealism at least. It started in the 1990s. This shift against compromise begins in the middle 90s, and it happens because George Herbert Walker Bush violates his pledge, the No New Taxes pledge. How about that for single causal explanations?
Exactly.
Probably many of my colleagues are going to do it, but let me put it this way. I think it's highly important to understand that. The Republican Party, which had never embraced the Bush, they were more ideological. And that Bush was viewed as a good government Republican who was a pragmatic Reaganite. Anyway, when he violates that pledge and raises taxes, many in the party structure, the young members in the party structure, said, never again. And when he goes down to defeat in 1992, the party begins to rethink what it's all about. And one of the things that was a constant in American politics to that point was that the Democrats controlled Congress. The Senate went back and forth occasionally, but not often. It's basically the Democrats who, now that didn't, by the way, that doesn't mean that liberalism dominated politics because you had conservative Democrats, but Democrats controlled Congress. There was a shift of old conservative Democrats to the Republican Party. The Republican Party had this dream of becoming majority party. And people like Newt Gingrich made the argument, we have to see our party as a flow-through from the people to Washington. We have to make clear we're not an elite. We're not Burkean conservatives. We're not going to be representatives of the people who go to the Capitol, learn what they need to learn, and then decide on behalf of the people. No. We're going to let the people tell us exactly what we're going to do. And we're going to have a contract with those people. And if we break that contract, we should expect to be primaried out and replaced by someone more loyal to those promises. And one of those promises was no new taxes. Now, that very approach to government introduced inflexibility, because basically what you're saying is if you compromise, you are part of the Washington elite, that culture, that cesspool. You're not doing what the people want you to do, those who sent you there. So the beginning of this inflexibility is in the mid-'90s. You still had some of the old good government Republicans there. After the Great Recession of 2008, there was a huge shift, understandably, a huge trauma. There was a trauma. And many people were angry, and they had every right to be. And they were angry about the way in which there seemed to be a bipartisan approach to the recession that involved saving the banks. And they thought, you're sending our tax dollars to save the banks, and I don't see a single banker taking the perp walk. I don't see a single one of them going to jail. I think there is an elite in Washington. They say they're Republicans and Democrats, but they're all the same. And that's the Tea Party. And so what that does is it returns it's the same argument as the argument of the mid-'90s, but with more ferocity, adding to even more inflexibility. So what you have is a Republican Party whose leaders have won their power by being inflexible. You can't ask those people, I mean, you should try, but you can't expect those people to compromise.
Tim, this tone of inflexibility, the style that's emanating from the White House, we've discussed its impact on the Republican Party. Let's talk about the Democrats. And as we are in the early stages of the Democratic nomination process, we have quite a large number of potential nominees still in the race. How do you see that changing style in Washington and in the wider country, inflexibility and stark rhetoric? How do you see that affecting the Democratic nomination?
But let me tell you how observers are thinking about it, and then we'll discuss the implications. So what became popular, and I still see this trope, is that there are different lanes in the Democratic primary campaign. You have the socialist, social democrat, the Occupy Wall Street lane that was dominated. Actually, he was alone in that lane by Bernie Sanders in 2016. But now Elizabeth Warren, arguably, is in the same lane. Then you have the Clinton sort of good government triangulation, not conservative, but pro-free trade lane. And that one, I'm not sure who's left in that lane. We'll see who's in, and maybe Kamala Harris a little. I don't know. I'm unclear whether it's unclear to me whether Cory Booker is. And then the third lane is the new, sharp, new, great new leader lane, the Obama lane, right? And who is going to capture the imagination? And the argument is that in the end you're going to have just three options. I should have mentioned Biden for the Clinton slash Obama, because Biden is certainly not the new young thing lane.
Yeah.
And so that is the way people have thought about it. I'm not sure that's helpful, frankly, because I don't think primary voters sit down and say, well, okay, all right, I'm going to, this is the one, this is my socialist that I want, and they don't think that way. And I don't think they can be divided. I don't think the electorate can be divided on the Democratic side that way. What we're seeing right now is a debate about first principles in the Democratic Party. This is a fertile moment. They have to figure out what they believe in. If you don't accept the orthodoxy of the Clinton-Obama years, because President Obama was a globalist. He was in support of free trade. He creates the TPP with the help of the New Zealanders and the Kiwis and others. So you have that set of ideas. And then you have the Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and Donald Trump. Don't forget that even though Trump is not a thinker, he has found an emotional intelligence. He is connected to an emotional intelligence, which the Democrats, if they want to do well in Ohio and Pennsylvania and in Wisconsin and Michigan, would be foolhardy to ignore.
Yeah.
So I think what we're seeing right now is a huge debate. Now, one thing that is clear is that all the Democrats are concerned about climate change. And oddly enough, that used to be a point of some intersection between the governing elites, not between the Congress and the presidency. But George W. Bush, while he was not a committed environmentalist, didn't have any doubts, really, in terms of about climate change. But now we have a government, an executive, that is absolutely not only climate skeptic, but is doing the absolute opposite, is actually increasing the amount of carbon in the air. I think you can count on the Democrats, in whoever is the nominee, making the environment something that they will deal with. Whether it's a carbon tax or cap and trade, that is their approach, and both have implications for policy. We don't know yet, but we can expect. But whether they're protectionists and whether they believe in the redistribution of income and by how much, and what they think of regulations, that is what we're watching. It's a very exciting time to be watching what's going on the Democratic side. I will add one more point. You will hear again and again electability. you will hear people, particularly supporters of former Vice President Biden, saying what is most important is that the Democrats, defeat Donald Trump. Electability is an interesting term. If we were having this conversation in 2007, and we were asking about electability on the Democratic side, who would have said Barack Obama?
Yeah.
Who would have said Hillary Clinton? So I anticipate that is an elastic term that's going to be redefined over and over again.
Let me finish with a question. Your classes, Tim, the discussions you have with NYU students, how do you inspire them, challenge them to raise the level of debate, to increase the societal trust in facts, in evidence, in the things that are being diminished?
I try to make a couple of points. One is that they have agency, that they have power. One of the things I do with students is I often show them material that has been recently declassified or released. And I said, you know what? You could write an essay in my class that is publishable because everything up to now didn't have that information, and you're as smart as any of us. So the first thing I tell them is that if you are an empiricist, if you care about data, you can change the world. Don't assume that everything's been decided and figured out. So I try to tell them the power of data. That's one. The second thing is I tell them that there are cycles of despair and hope and opportunity in our history, in American history. And that Americans surprise themselves. They also disappoint themselves. And it's up to them to determine whether the future is a cycle of disappointment or happy surprise. That this country is far more flexible and malleable than they think. And finally, I tell them, or remind them, that their elders make mistakes. And as long as their elders admit those mistakes, everybody can learn from them. And that they have an opportunity to make their own mistakes. But to make those mistakes in a way that is helpful to themselves and society, they have to do their homework. And they have to know things. And knowing things is the way to start the process of analysis.
The power of knowledge and education.
Yes.
Fabulous. Tim Naftali, thank you very much. This has been fascinating.
Thank you very much, President Hamilton. It's been my pleasure.
Visit nyu.edu/conversations to subscribe to the podcast and learn more.